Thank you. Well, welcome, Dr. Kristin Kobes Du Mez. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here.
Super fun. I read your book, Jesus and John Wayne, for a sermon series, actually, that we did this fall. And I was pretty much living that entire time with my jaw on the ground. So I'm super excited to have you with us today. We've got a bunch of questions for you. But
sorry about that. Sorry, not sorry. It was a fascinating book and I couldn't hold back. So
and this outline is after I told Kyle he had to take several questions off. Can you, Kristin, is that okay if we call you Kristin?
Yes, please.
All right. Kristin, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what got you to where you are now?
Sure. I grew up in a small town in Iowa, Sioux Center, Iowa. It's a very kind of conservative enclave. I grew up in a Dutch community, a Christian Reformed church. And so rather isolated in retrospect, I can see. My family moved to Florida for a couple of years while I was in high school, and then I ended up being an exchange student in Germany. So I did see a bit of the world, but then I came back to Sioux Center and went to college at Dordt, a Christian university. And from there, I went off to study religious and intellectual history at the University of Notre Dame. And my very first semester there, just a few weeks in, I encountered my first book of women's history, gender studies, and it just rocked my world. And I completely shifted my course of study. I kept the study of American religious history, but added a field in women's history and gender. And I just was fascinated by how ideas of masculinity and femininity changed over time, how they were linked to all sorts of broader shifts, economic shifts, foreign policy. And I think you can kind of see how one thing led to another. My first book was actually a history of Christian feminism. And this book actually grew out of a conversation that I had with some students about 15 years ago. Who introduced me to John Eldredge's Wild at Heart and conceptions of kind of militant Christian manhood. And this was right during the early years of the Iraq War. And I started wondering what these militant conceptions of masculinity might have to do with the survey data that was coming out at the time, that white evangelicals were far and away more likely to support the war, to support preemptive war, condone the use of torture, and this militarism that was very pronounced. And so that really set me on the path eventually to write Jesus and John Wayne.
So you've been working on this for 15 years.
No. So I started, I should fill in the gaps there. I did start for about a year kind of playing around. This was before I'd written my first book, which had grown out of my dissertation. So I had a few other things going on, but I was just dabbling in this project. And then I ended up setting it aside for a couple of reasons. I had 2 kids in quick succession and realized I couldn't write 2 books at once. And but also I was really disturbed by what I was discovering. I found it revolting, frankly. It was deeply misogynistic.
I was going to say, how do you write about this for 15 years? My God.
Oh my gosh, no. That was part of the reason I set it aside. But related to that, it wasn't clear to me how mainstream this all was, right? So I was wondering, am I just seeing this fringe movement? And do I need to be shining this bright light on what might be the darkest underbelly of American Christianity? Is this worth the effort, and does this need to be done? And I just wasn't really sure. So I set it aside, took up other projects. Life kind of happened. And then it was in the fall of 2016, actually in the weeks after the Access Hollywood tape released, that I thought, I need to dust off that old research. I'm seeing some things come together, and particularly that question of how much of this is really fringe and how much of it is really close to the mainstream was solved at that point.
That's actually a great segue into my first question about the book, if that's okay. So my area of research, I'm an epistemologist, and I've recently been thinking a lot about echo chambers and public trust and that sort of thing, which is highly, highly relevant to many of the aspects of the book. And so I'm curious, just right off the bat, where you landed, I guess, on that question of, is it mainstream? Is it fringe? Is it a cult? Because there are some stark similarities between the ways that evangelicals have organized themselves socially and the ways that groups that anyone would recognize as a cult organize themselves, and also similarities in thought patterns. So one piece of the book that made me think of this in particular is you were talking about John Wayne's movies, The Alamo and The Green Berets. And at one point you said the fact that those movies were viciously panned and vilified was a point in their favor
Yes.
for a lot of evangelicals. And that's like a classic feature of cults or echo chambers, right? You're like immunized against critique. You encounter the critique, but it doesn't have an impact because you've already been told what to think about it. That's like classic cult move, and that's exactly what evangelicals do. So is it fair to call evangelicalism a cult at this point?
So I'm not an expert on cults, but I do know enough to know to be careful with that terminology, right? There's a kind of popular usage and then there's a more technical usage. I think it would be fair to call some of these more extreme communities within evangelicalism cult-like, and I'm thinking here particularly some of the independent fundamental Baptist communities, and then evangelicalism writ large. There are some tendencies, as you suggest, this kind of inoculation against external critique, this persecution complex, really the sense of us versus them, and that we hold the truth. We hold God's truth, and anybody outside of these walls, outside of this community, they do not have the source of truth. And so why would we want to empower them? And so there are certainly some tendencies that I think run parallel. That said, no, I don't think most white evangelicals are in a cult right now. What fascinated me, though, was the relationship between the more mainstream, the more moderate, if you will, evangelicals, and the more fringe parts of the movement. And I think that's a theme that you can see running through this book, is me trying to test out, okay, you've got Bill Gothard here, and then you got James Dobson. Gothard, definitely extreme. James Dobson, pretty mainstream as far as evangelicalism goes. At the end of the day, they're saying things that are really quite similar. And so that's what fascinated me. What's the connection and what are the affinities between the moderate, quote unquote, respectable mainstream evangelicals, even, institutions like Christianity Today, and then these more fringe movements, and how are the alliances forged and boundaries drawn? So who's inside? Who do we consider my brother in Christ? And then who gets excluded ultimately? Who's going to be pushed out of the communion? Who's going to be pushed out of the community? And that's really where I ended up. And so what I see is that there are some strong affinities between the mainstream and more fringe movements. And then, and that's probably as far as I could go, discussing whether or not this is a cult. Although some of the behaviors, the practices are certainly worth examining.
Another kind of somewhat related to this thing that I've noticed, being an evangelical my whole life and only recently having given up the label, and largely as a result of higher education, which is exactly what my parents warned me about. Right? So I'm pretty sure my parents think I'm no longer a Christian because I got educated. But interestingly, in that there seemed to be a double standard, and this is also something I was reminded of in the book when you were talking about James Dobson. Like people like my parents, for example, or other strongly conservative evangelicals that I know, they buy wholesale into this. There's an academic cultural elite that is against the common person, and the average person would include most white evangelicals, until one of their own gets credentialed by the elite. And then they're like trumpeted as, look, they're giving it to the man. And Dobson's a good example of this, right? Because he got the credentials from the respected university, and then he used it for evangelical purposes. So like, how should we understand that kind of seeming double standard there?
Oh, I mean, I think you got that exactly right. There's a real suspicion of, again, of outsiders, of outside knowledge, of outside expertise. That was something that was very clear through my research. Decades ago, evangelicals were saying, we need our own media. Don't consume mainstream media, mainstream news. We need our own news organizations. We need our own magazines. We need our own, we have our own Christian contemporary music and all of that, this evangelical subculture. And that was developed, and it was so strong because they were rejecting so much of the mainstream. culture at the time, and continuing to today. And I think we see the same thing with kind of academic expertise, that if it is one of our own, and if we can then hold that up as, see, we can do it, but we can do it even better. And that then they gain this real status within evangelicalism. And you can see that with scholars, with academics. I think somebody like Eric Metaxas is kind of an interesting example here, where, just even 5 years ago, or maybe we need to go 6 years ago, but certainly 10 years ago, he was known as kind of the evangelical intellectual, and he could hold his own, Socrates in the city and so on. And he was really, admired for that he could kind of go toe to toe with the brightest, the best and the brightest, and in New York City of all places. And, it's been interesting to see what he's become, especially in recent years and recent weeks. And to wonder what that was, right? That was just an act. Has evangelicalism changed so much? I think in some ways it has, but now there's a different appeal. And being the suave intellectual isn't where it's at all anymore. It's really, I think, given into this populist movement. And Metaxas 4 or 5 years ago saw where it was going. He was very astute and kind of changed his tune. And now he's trying to do the populist thing, which may or may not work out well for him.
Maybe he'll run for president in 4 years.
Oh, God. Did you see the video of him probably punching someone?
Of course, I saw that video. Yes, and retreating, and yes, that was a delight.
This reality that what my first thing in your book, and again, that's Jesus and John Wayne, how white evangelicals corrupted a faith and fractured a nation. It is a must read, listeners. If you have not read it yet, you have to, particularly if you are a white evangelical. It's a must read. You have to. And if you want to continue being an evangelical afterwards, great. But at least the underbelly after that. But the first light bulb that went on was when you talked about how bookstores, of all places, are kind of like the key holders and the stakeholders in who's in and who's out, really. Like I grew up going to Family Christian Store, I mean, I say that to my shame, but Family Christian Store, Lifeway, what is it?
Lifeway Christian Books.
Yeah. Funded by the SBC, basically this reality that maybe 3-4 guys who have power within evangelicalism, who are kind of self-appointed and also just seen as being the end all be all, the authority, if and when they decide that Rachel Held Evans is no longer in the camp, or Jen Hatmaker is no longer a Christian, she's now a heretic, or Rob Bell, goodbye Rob Bell from John Piper. The minute that they decide that, these bookstores take their stuff off the shelves, and immediately they become irrelevant heretics that nobody ever talks about. That blew me away. That reality.
Yeah, that is how that works. And the Christian bookstore, I really lament as a researcher that Christian bookstore chains have gone out of business, because I would just as research practice every month or so walk through a Christian bookstore, long before I knew I'd be writing this book, just to kind of take the pulse of evangelical consumer culture. Which books are being promoted, which books are on the shelves, what sorts of home decor, those sorts of things. And so it always fascinated me. And I think this is autobiographical a bit too, because I talked about growing up in a kind of ethnic enclave. I did not identify as evangelical, even though it was very conservative Christian. It was in the Christian Reformed tradition. And my tradition really long identified over against American evangelicalism. We were distinctive. And so I never identified as an evangelical. That said, when I met real evangelicals, when I went off to Notre Dame, which is not where you would think you would go to meet evangelicals, turns out there are a lot of folks there studying with my advisor at the time, George Marston, who were coming from Moody Bible Institute, coming from Bob Jones, coming from Wheaton College. And so I met real evangelicals, and the points of connection that we had were precisely the popular culture. Because in my hometown, a town of 6,000 people, there was one bookstore. It was a Christian bookstore, right? And so I was exposed, even though I never identified as an evangelical. I was always Calvinist, Christian Reformed, Dutch. But my whole kind of cultural formation in the faith was the books that were sold there, the music that was sold there. Every kind of graduation or major life event, I would get a wall plaque that had some Bible verse or saying on it. The latest Chuck Colson book, right, was gifted to me.
Mhm.
And so I was very much participating in that subculture and the consumer culture, even though I didn't attend what I considered an evangelical church or even identify as an evangelical.
Mhm. So, Kristin, just because you went there, what was in the playlist of Kristin Kobes growing up in high school? Family Christian show.
All right, let's talk. So, Jars of Clay.
Oh, yes.
That's gonna date me. But before that, even Petra. Oh my gosh,
Oh,
don't let your
man.
hearts be hardened. Amy Grant, of course, always Amy Grant. Michael Card. So Little Better
Wow,
Taste.
that's deep.
Right. Let's see what else.
Michael W.
Oh, Michael W. Smith. Absolutely, Michael W. Smith. And then my one kind of secular purchase,
Uh-oh.
which was really bad. I didn't listen to secular radio at all. I considered that disobedient. But I gave into temptation and bought a Tiffany cassette. Tiffany. And so my parents, when they actually heard the lyrics, were not super thrilled. We had to have a talk about that. But yeah, that's as much as I dabbled in actual popular music.
Wow. I mean, judging by who you listen to, we must be really close in age because oh mine, yeah. Wow, that's incredible. We could do a whole little episode on 80s and 90s Christian contemporary music.
Evangelical pop culture.
Oh, definitely.
That you were forced to watch the video talking about how Amy Grant is a satanic woman.
So that didn't, I guess I wasn't evangelical enough for that, but no, I mean, she did fall from grace. That was very clear. So.
Yeah. Okay. Back to the outline, Kyle.
So I do have one question that it's about a topic that doesn't have a very prominent place in the book, but you say at one point, and this is a quote, that same-sex relationships challenge the most basic assumptions of the evangelical worldview.
Yeah.
So most of the book is about gender complementarianism and women's issues, and occasionally you touch on the LGBTQ stuff. So would you mind fleshing out that statement for us?
Sure. Yeah, I could have written more on that. That was one of the topics that I kept thinking, can I do more? Do I have space? I was really, really up against word count in this book, way over. Actually, I had to trim it back considerably. And then pulling together so many different threads through the book. And so I was wondering, could I add that? Really, I could have done more on same-sex relationships and more on abortion. Both of those are part of this narrative, but not a major part. And what I meant by that is, when I really started to think about, the hot button issues that emerged in the religious right, both abortion and same-sex marriage, both of those really went against this all important gender difference as a fundamental kind of ordering of creation, ordering of society, that God made men and women utterly different. And that these distinct gender roles, that men were protectors and providers and women were weak and submissive, and they needed to be very feminine and protected and just utterly distinct. Dobson makes that very clear. That was really the fundamental difference. And when you and then marriage was where you bring difference together in a hierarchical relationship, which again orders society. Then the rest of society is built upon that relationship. And that was so fundamental. So same-sex relationships just completely blew that out of the water, right? Gender difference, this complementarian relationship, the building blocks of society, which they believed was, God ordained throughout all of time, the marker of faithful, obedient Christianity. And so really for me, it was trying to understand why was that such a hot button issue in ways that other issues were not. And you could say, well, Christians have always been, against quote unquote homosexuality until you start looking at history and it's a lot more complicated. And yes, there certainly is this long tradition of opposition, but there's also a lot of fluidity, especially look at the history of sexuality and than the relationship between Christianity and this history of sexuality. And it's just much more complicated, but it certainly became a flashpoint. And in the 1960s, in the 1970s, as did abortion, right? And abortion, I think, is in some ways a clearer sense of it became a flashpoint not as early as we would have thought it would be, right? It was not at the origins of the rise of the religious right. It came along a little bit later. When it was really identified with this idea of what is a woman's proper role, when it was identified with feminism threatening that appropriate role, that's when evangelicals really coalesced as a kind of pro-life movement. Whereas in the late 60s, many evangelicals, including conservative evangelicals, had very mixed views on abortion. It wasn't a great thing. It was sometimes necessary. It was sometimes needed. It was just not this flashpoint that it would become just even a decade later, in the context of this real kind of doubling down on gender difference and family values as just the foundation of religious orthodoxy, and over against feminism, over against these disruptions of the 1960s and 1970s. So I really just wanted to historicize it, and rather than start with abortion, homosexuality, always these contentious issues, that they became that way as part of a broader historical context, and we should understand them in that sense.
So, Kristin, in the chapter "God's Gift to Man," which, I mean, you should purchase this book just for the chapter titles alone. I mean, they're incredible. We'll highlight some further in the interview, but in the chapter "God's Gift to Man," where you talk about these major feminine voices within evangelicalism, starting at Maribel Morgan, Phyllis Schlafly, Elizabeth Elliot, and all sorts of them, who basically actively worked in just were activists against feminism and against the Equal Rights Amendment and equal rights for women, equal pay. The whole thing blew me away, like fully blew me away. Women campaigning actively against equal rights. Now, I've seen conservative women say feminism is dangerous and it's liberal and there's an agenda. I've seen that. I still don't get it. But even actively campaigning against equal rights amendment and trying to get that out. I mean, again, I just couldn't believe it. It reminds me to Candace Owens and people like her, these African-American folks who will just say really loudly that racism is not a thing and it's just an imagined thing and here's all the reasons. And then basically what that does, it seems to me, is it gives a lot of white evangelical Americans the right to say, hey, see, that African-American woman said racism isn't a thing, so I'm right, and it's okay for me to be racist. What's going on there? You're a woman.
Yes, I am.
Research that. Were you equally as appalled? I mean, what's that dynamic? What's the reasoning and the rationale behind that, do you think?
So I'd say a difference between what we see in the 60s and 70s and even to today with conservative white evangelical women and somebody like Candace Owens is that the evangelical women who are, leaders, who are, kind of gain celebrity status by promoting this conservative femininity, represent far more white evangelical women than Candace Owens would represent, African Americans in this country. So I think it is somewhat different. And within evangelicalism, women like Beverly LaHaye or Phyllis Schlafly was Catholic, but I kind of consider her an honorary evangelical because evangelicals embraced her and she was extremely influential within evangelical circles. But women like Elizabeth Elliot, and so they're not just they don't just give cover. They really do inspire. They represent other conservative evangelical women, and they inspire conservative women to embrace this understanding of what it means to be a faithful Christian woman. And that just comes through over and over again. When I looked at what was going on in the 60s and 70s, I actually I mean, I was horrified when I knew kind of where it ended up, but I really understood, I think, where many of these women were coming from. Because even though I identify as a feminist and I'm very grateful for the opportunities that feminism has given to me, when kind of feminism is just kind of announced, it comes on the scene in dramatic ways in the 1970s, and many of women had already kind of made life choices. Many women already didn't have the education they would need to have much of a career. Many women had opted out of careers. Many women were at home with 3 or 4 kids. Right, they had no real economic prospects, and so for women in those situations, being told, hey, guess what, you're equal, or being told in a fear-mongering kind of way, they are going to take away your femininity, they're going to force you to be like men, they're going to force you to go fight wars, they're going to force you to go earn your keep. Good luck with that, right? And that's the messaging that they were getting. You can see where for many women this was not liberation, this was scary, and they had already made their choices. And so it was kind of, playing with the hand that you were dealt. But then again, I don't want to detract from the fact that so many conservative Christian women truly believed that the way to be a godly woman, the way to honor God and be faithful to Christ, really, was to live this domesticity, this conservative femininity. And I just don't
Mhm.
think we can undersell that. And that is still the case for so many women that I meet today, including many of my students.
Mm.
Right, I teach at a Christian university, and the messaging is still very powerful. That as a Christian woman, you have certain duties, and these have to come first, and these other things are likely to distract from those. And you just, you can get an education, great, you can start a career if you like, but just make sure that you have your priorities straight in order to really honor God with your life. And so there's a real
Mhm.
sincere faith that's also at play, but that faith, of course, has been formed by generations of teachings, of preaching from the pulpit, of books by Elizabeth Elliot, organizations like Beverly LaHaye's. And so this is not just an organic kind of understanding. This is an ideology that has been perpetuated for generations in very,
Yeah.
very powerful ways.
Yeah, I'm sure.
As you're saying that, I'm thinking of like really good friends of mine who to this day would probably have a hard time conceptualizing a Christian life without the influence of somebody like Elizabeth Elliot. I think it's really
Yeah.
difficult to overstate the influence that she had. And outside of the evangelical subculture, nobody seems to have heard of her. But within it, like the sort of fundamentalist campus ministry that I was in college, there were 2 books that were required reading for everyone in that group. One was, I think it was called Passion and Purity.
Yes.
Every woman in the group had to read that book, and every man was expected to read the one that she wrote to her nephew, The Mark of a Man, or whatever it was
Right.
called.
Right. Oh,
And as an
interesting.
impressionable 20-year-old, I was kind of convinced by it because she, maybe uniquely, I'm not sure, she is the clearest that I found amongst the complementarians on rooting that kind of understanding of gender in an understanding of the Trinity. She's very
Yes,
explicit about it. And
she
so it
is.
gives you this like unshakable theological grounding for why it is this way and why it
Yes.
obviously must be this way.
Exactly, exactly. She kind of led the way with that, what some people would call heresy, and others would defend as biblical truth today. Right, the eternal subordination of the Son as a model of the
Mhm.
eternal subordination of women.
I mean, that's just
Which is hilarious and ironic that was that idea came
It
from a
came from a
woman.
woman, right, right, right.
had me think to me though is, I mean, I've had conversations like this. I'm sure you guys have. I'm sure listeners have, where you're talking with a woman and you're trying to convince her of her. It's not her value because she'd say I'm valuable. But that like she's got more in her than she thinks, and she's arguing with you against that. That's a crazy thing, and it makes me a little upset at some of the Elizabeth Elliots of the world, because that is such a powerful thing, that tool that they have there
Yeah.
is that misogynistic men and leaders can continue suppressing women because of the females that say, no, this is great, this is the way we're
Yeah.
created, this should be.
Right.
That's a powerful argument.
Right. And some women are wired to really, enjoy, some women really have no desire to have a career. Some women absolutely love being in the home, being a mom and a wife. And that is great. And the problems obviously come when that becomes the only way to be a Christian woman. And for many, many women who are not wired to really find their fulfillment, to feel that they are called in different directions or in multiple directions, and then to be told that you are disobedient and you cannot be a faithful Christian if you follow what you feel really are, or to use Christian language, the vocation that God has given you. And that's where the tension emerges. But for some women, they are perfectly content, and kind of wired to be that way. And I think that part of the power of these teachings, this ideology, was to tell those women that their life, their way of life was threatened, that they were going to be kind of ripped out of their homes and forced to do something that they didn't want to do by feminism, by the ERA, by big government, by whatever that the threat of the day might be.
Yep. Let's move on, Kyle.
Yeah, so we've hit on LGBTQ issues and now feminism. Let's get the evangelical hot button issue trifecta here. Go for the hat trick. Let's talk about racism. So here's just a kind of a, I don't know, very direct way to put the question: is there an evangelicalism without racism?
Yes, there is. And to answer this more fully, though, we're going to have to get into the tricky definition of, what is evangelicalism? What are we talking about? And you'll notice in the subtitle, I was very explicit. This is a story about white evangelicalism. And evangelicalism itself is a term that has really morphed in meaning over time, from the 18th century through the 19th century, early 20th century, mid 20th century. You can kind of trace the shift in meaning that the term connoted at different moments in history. And I mean, that's something I do a little bit in the book, and I've done more elsewhere. But what I push back against in this book are attempts to define evangelicalism purely as a set of theological beliefs. So this kind of rubric that, okay, you believe in conversionism, the centrality of the cross, the authority of the Bible, and boom, 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 there you are, an evangelical. And then you just lump all these evangelicals, because if you do that, then the majority of Black Protestants in the United States are quote unquote evangelical. The majority of global Christians, if they're not Catholic, they're going to be evangelical, and which is fine if you're, for some questions. To understand American evangelicalism as a historical and cultural movement, that's where I say that rubric isn't going to get you very far. Because the truth is, most Black Protestants do not identify as evangelical, not at all. And there are very clear reasons for that, right? They do not go to the same churches as white evangelicals for the most part. They do not read the same books, listen to the same music, listen to the same radio stations for the most part. So why are we insisting on counting them as the same thing? When we do that, we end up, some scholars or observers will say, see, evangelicalism can't possibly be racist because we're going to include all Black Protestants and global Christians in this. I'm saying no. As a historian and as a cultural historian, I'm going to describe what I'm seeing. And this is a rather distinctive movement with a little bit of overlap, interplay with Black Protestantism, with global Christianity. But we're really looking at a fairly cohesive movement, series of networks, relationships. I look at evangelicalism, again, largely as a consumer culture. Are you formed by these consumer products? And when we're looking at that, then white evangelicalism is its own thing. And when we look at white evangelicalism, then we can ask your question again. Can you be a white evangelical and not be racist? You still can. There is always a kind of minority movement, has always been within white evangelicalism over the last half century. The evangelical left has been very pro-civil rights, anti-racist. This is like the Sojourners folks in the 1960s, 1970s. This is, Tom Skinner is an African-American evangelical. Like that still is a part of the movement. It's not the dominant part of the movement. And this is where understanding kind of relations of power and relative power across the movement is important. To understand white evangelicalism, you have to understand the significance of Southern evangelicals in shaping the broader white evangelical movement. You can see that through migration patterns from the Deep South into the Sun Belt, into Southern California, which then goes national, right, with the rise of the religious right. You can look at that in terms of the kind of celebrity culture, the media culture. I mean, John Wayne works in the title in all kinds of different ways. This kind of, Hollywood, Southern California celebrity evangelicalism that develops. And with evangelicalism that we see as it takes shape as a cultural and political movement by the end of the 1970s and afterwards, you cannot separate its whiteness from its religious identity and its religious values, and you cannot fully extricate the racism that is also a part of the movement to greater or lesser degrees. So some white evangelicals, particularly I think in the South, in the 1960s, 1970s, yes, they are racist, they are segregationists, they are motivated out of those values. Somebody like Jerry Falwell Sr., right? You have the development of Christian schools, Christian academies that are segregationist academies, and the religious right mobilizes in part to defend those academies on their right to exist. That is absolutely part of the story of white evangelicalism today. It's not the only part. And so again, the interesting thing to me is you've got that strand, you still have racist white evangelicals, but you have the majority of white evangelicals do not think of themselves as racist. They do not hold personal animosity towards people of color for the most part, right? If somebody would walk into their church, whatever color they were, they'd be warmly welcomed. And so I wanted to understand what kind of accommodations have taken place, what kind of unexamined values that are deeply rooted in whiteness really give shape to white evangelicalism today. And that's where I'd point to, in particular, Christian nationalism, which, if you think about it, the idea that America was a Christian nation founded as God's chosen nation, everything was really great until somewhere around the 1960s, right? That only makes sense if you're a white person. Only makes sense. And that, but it's never presented as this is a kind of white religious identity or white religious value. It's just the way things are within conservative evangelical circles. So those are the kinds of things that I really tried to bring out in this book, how race worked, how whiteness worked, to make whiteness visible when so many evangelicals don't make it visible and therefore are not even able to see it themselves.
Yeah. And some evangelical leaders are skilled at making it invisible.
Yes.
So one thing I've noticed, and I don't know if you've done any specific research on this, but you mentioned something in the book that brings it to mind, is we can kind of mask our racism by attaching racial activism or activism for racial justice to something else that we already know beyond a shadow of a doubt is bad and something we should be against, right? So you mentioned in the book that I think it was Jerry Falwell Sr., equated the civil rights movement with Marxism. And everybody knows you're supposed to be against the communists. Nobody could define what Marxism is, and nobody's read Marx, but we all know communism is bad.
Very bad.
And today, Black Lives Matter, same thing, it's over again.
Very
right?
familiar.
Critical race theory. It's either because they're in favor of LGBTQ stuff or because somehow critical race theory is Marxist. Again, nobody can define Marxism, but we know that's bad.
And very few people can define critical race theory. I mean, that has been fascinating.
Even including critical race theorists.
Right. Fascinating to see in the last 2 years, for me as a cultural historian, as somebody who studies this, to suddenly start hearing all about critical race theory, more than I've ever heard about it before.
To hear Tim Keller talk about critical race theory, I never thought I'd see it.
Exactly. It's and yes, when you know the history, oh, we've seen this before. Yep. So call it Marxist, call it, or much of the opposition to kind of civil rights, post-Civil Rights Act, 1964 and 1965's Voting Rights Act as well. Once that was, many moderate evangelicals supported those measures. So this is a Billy Graham type of, moderate evangelicalism, whereas fundamentalists and some Southern evangelicals still opposed even those measures. But by and large, the majority of evangelicals were okay with that. And then they thought, okay, we're good. That's good. Anything beyond that could easily get dismantled as disrupting the social order. So law and order politics, really strong by the late 60s and certainly by the 70s in evangelical circles. And yes, Marxism, targeting it with Marxism. Also, slightly less extreme. So this isn't socialism or Marxism, but it's big government, and we're anti-big government. And of course, in that moment, what is the big government doing? What is the federal government doing? They are interfering with states' rights in order to enforce desegregation. So again, historical context is just really critical because there are so many of these words that really are racially coded words. And evangelicals can use those so fluently and have been for generations that if you don't know the history, it's hard to understand just how racialized those values actually are.
So in chapter 11, otherwise known as the best chapter name in the book, Holy Balls, in chapter Holy Balls, Kristin, you write pretty extensively about the black hole that is, and was and really is, the testosterone-fueled New Calvinist movement, the neo-reformed guys. And you talk a lot about Mark Driscoll in particular, but there's all these superstar megachurch pastors who, and many of them have fallen from grace. I mean, it felt like a year and a half where it was just like dominoes falling, whether it's Driscoll or McDonald or CJ Mahaney, all of them. Do you think these guys had major they had doctrinal differences that we'll talk about in a little bit, but their theology is very ironclad, and it's really, in many ways, I would say testosterone fueled, masculine driven theology. These neo-reform guys. Do you think that theology had anything to do with the way they found that their end, and for Driscoll, I'm just going to say ministry wise, unfortunately, it wasn't the end, but their fall from grace, do you think that had to do anything to do with their theology actually?
I think it did. There's never a direct route, and then it's like, well, what came first? Were these men drawn to this theology because of how they were wired, because of who they were, and because of their own maybe excessive testosterone or perception thereof? And were they then drawn to this theology? Then this theology reinforced those behaviors, justified or condoned those behaviors. It's really hard for me to see because I think it works both ways all the time. And then watching how I mean, in that group in particular, it became really apparent to me just how these networks functioned and how so many men were drawn to the power of other men and wanting to participate in those networks, want to participate in, to share a stage, to emulate, to pattern their own preaching after somebody like Mark Driscoll. He was enormously popular. I mean, he was one of the guys that early on, back, 15 some years ago, I was looking at and saying, who is this guy? Is he mainstream? And of course, he was hugely popular, the celebrity, but was he popular? I wondered because the media likes to cover him because he's so egregious. But no, when you look inside evangelicalism, he was so influential for more than a decade, really, as this model of a successful ministry. And so many evangelical men that I've talked to listened to him for hours on end, his sermons. And so many evangelical pastors wanted to be just like him. And so that's where, no, his influence was profound, I think. And so, yeah, I'm not sure what ultimately came first, but the theology and the behavior were mutually reinforcing. And that's part of how we got to where we ended up.
Yep. And I mean, we could do another whole episode on Driscoll and his comrades and what they did to the faith, and both in fashion and in theology. Let's be honest. I mean, the ripped, bedazzled jeans. Mark Driscoll sold many of those.
So here's a complaint I had when I was looking for pictures for this book. I had a lot of fun picking out pictures, and I had to do it on an incredibly tight turnaround to get it out in time for the 2020 election. So I had about a week to find all the photographs for the book. I really wanted one that really showed off the Driscoll fashion, and there were no quality photographs available that I had rights to. So I don't know if there's any listeners out there who have a good snapshot they could send to me. We can get it in a future edition.
Absolutely. One with the
Oh,
big
man.
fat bracelets and watch.
Yes.
Yes. So m- moving or in that vein, you talk about this reality that, again, it's one of those things that feels like it's been hiding in plain sight. When you said it, I was like, oh my gosh, yep, that's absolutely right. There's all these reformed leaders within the church, and particularly with 10 years ago or so, who really are quite different, both in the way they carry themselves and the way they preach. Their theology is quite different even. But they kind of banded together, whether it's John Piper, Mark Driscoll, John MacArthur. I mean, these guys are very different.
Doug Wilson, let's throw him in there.
Yeah, oh my gosh.
Hmm.
And you wouldn't expect to
No.
see them on the same stage in a million years, but they did, and they celebrated one another, and they overlooked one another's real nasty stuff because they got a few things right. And you make the point that there's these small handful of things, doctrinal things, that if you got them right, you could be part of the brotherhood, which were mostly a doctrine of hell that was dark and scary, believing that homosexuality is a sin, believing in penal substitutionary theory of atonement. That's really important, right? There's a couple of others, but really, and then complementarianism. You have to be complementarian. Those four things were really like, if you're good with all those, you're in our club. That's wild to me.
Yeah.
How do you think that came to be? How did those things rise to the surface?
Oh, I mean, there's no simple answer. There really isn't. Going back to the 1960s is really where I'd want to go back to. That's when you start to see the battle lines really drawn, and who is orthodox and who is not. And yes, gender is very much at the heart of that. And even things like, penal atonement and the existence of hell are also cast in gendered terms as the proper masculine faith, and as the, father, punishing the son, and this kind of, harsh discipline, which is just, like, suck it up. This is Christianity kind of thing. And so gender really pervades this for a long time. And still it puzzled me, I think, to see it take shape. And I mean, I watched it take shape because in the 1990s, so I was born in 1976. So I graduated from college in 97 and went off to graduate school. And up until that time, I had been pretty isolated, again, in this ethnic subculture, this Christian Reformed tradition. I went to a Christian Reformed college, very separate from the rest of American Christianity. And then I headed off to study American religious history. And so again, I'm meeting all these evangelicals, and I'm kind of getting the lay of the land. And that's right around the time that you see the burgeoning of this young, restless, and reformed movement. And I'm hearing about them. And at first I'm thinking, yes, finally, right? I'd been in this little enclave, and these are my people. Like, good for us, right? We're John Piper reformed. I'm reformed. This is awesome. And I was in a Bible study, and of course we were reading John Piper, because what else would you read if you're in an intervarsity Bible study, right? In the 90s. And then increasingly I came to see, well, gradually, I don't think I am this, right? And they certainly don't think that I would be one of them. Right. I'm not complementarian. I took an entire course in the Institutes of the Christian Religion, right? Calvin's Institutes. I know my Reformed theology. I've been immersed in it. I'm a scholar, right? All that stuff would count for nothing. I would never share a stage with Piper unless I'm gonna be, on the side talking to the wives, telling them to be complementarian kind of thing, right? And that's when I understood how boundaries are drawn, right? And so what is uniting people? And is it the historic Christian faith? Is it apostolic faith? Is it, what is? No, it's not. That's not enough. It's absolutely not enough. It's this set of issues, and it's a very gendered set of issues. And I was de facto excluded from that. And that's kind of this personal realization that came only very gradually, which I think is then I was trying to make sense of in this book as well.
Mm-hmm. So Kristin, you've kind of left yourself off the hook for my next question then, which is another jaw-dropping moment when I saw on Twitter that you consider yourself reformed. Like you're just not trying to make your parents angry, right? You're not reformed, are you?
So that's so funny. That moment where I came out on Twitter as reformed, right? I mean, I teach at Calvin University. What do you expect? I grew up again. My dad is an ordained minister. He's a theology professor. I grew up. He wrote his dissertation on Abraham Kuyper. If that says anything to you all, and if that does, then I'll go one better and say, I studied Herman Dooyeweerd in
Nice.
college, and so yes, I'm very deeply reformed. But the reformed Christianity that I was introduced to was filtered through some of my undergraduate professors, none of whom were American. They were all Dutch or Dutch Canadian.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Reformed theology that I embraced was not in any way tainted by Christian nationalism, by American politics more generally. In fact, it was often set against that. It was more influenced by, kind of Dutch thinking, going back to even World War II, kind of anti-authoritarian, and very much an interpretation of Calvin that was not scholastic, not about the rules and enforcing. It was one that was life-giving, that was a much warmer and fuzzier version of Calvin. And that's how I read the Institutes, with that framework in mind, and had those parts of the tradition really just held out for me. And that has always been my Calvinism, and the Calvinism that formed me and that I continue to hold to today. And that's very much the Calvinism of Calvin University as well, where I teach. So I'm not alone. I'm not an outlier. I mean, in the broader landscape, absolutely. But I've always been in that tradition, and not the John Piper, Mark Driscoll, and certainly not the Doug Wilson sort.
Praise the Lord. Yep. So Kristin, last chance. This video won't make it public. So could you just wink twice if you're not really?
She winked. I don't know. Her word against mine now. So while we're on this theme of theology, how important do you think that theology really is or has been to evangelicals? If a lot of these things that are supposedly denominational distinctives can be given up so easily, as long as you're a complementarian or whatever, how important do you think theology really is to conservative white evangelicals? So, for example, when you're talking in the book about the SBC takeover in 1979, you say that inerrancy, which we think of as, my God, if there's a defining thing for evangelicals, it's that inerrancy mattered because of its connection to cultural and political issues. And then the implication is, of course, not the other way around. So this suggests that maybe theology hasn't been of essential importance. But at another place in the book, you talk about this quip that was used, Jesus can save your soul, but John Wayne will save your ass, right? I think it's another one of the great chapter titles. So this implies a kind of theological bifurcation of the spiritual and the material. And that still seems, that's like deeply within Protestantism. It still seems to be with a lot of American evangelicals. And it might explain a good chunk of Trump's Christian support at this point, because you hear all the time people saying, well, he might not be the best Christian ever, but that's not why I'm voting for him. I'm not voting for a savior. I'm voting for somebody to kick the asses of the people whose asses need to be kicked. So help us understand this trade-off between theological commitment and political expediency.
Yeah. So, evangelicals will self-identify first and foremost as Bible-believing Christians, and will particularly evangelical elites, who are the ones generally defining evangelicalism, are going to absolutely, again, point to this theological rubric, right? If you check these theological boxes, you are an evangelical. However, when you look at survey data, you can quickly see that, and this is surveys that are set up by evangelical organizations. You can see that there is an alarming level of theological illiteracy within evangelicalism. In fact, an astonishing number of evangelicals hold views traditionally considered heretical, right? And so I absolutely saw this in my own encounters with my own students, many of whom are coming from evangelical backgrounds, that there is little theological knowledge. Which made me wonder, all right, so if they don't know their theology, why is the theology considered fundamental here? But the first thing that tipped me off, honestly, was back at the very beginning when my students brought me the book Wild at Heart. And I was like, okay, let me read this. And I was shocked at how little of the Bible there was in it, right? Again, self-identifying Bible-believing Christians, and there's going to be a sprinkling of Bible verses completely decontextualized, right? But really there it was Hollywood heroes that Eldridge turned to, particularly Mel Gibson's William Wallace, right, as this heroic model of masculinity, therefore model of Christian masculinity, and then cowboys and soldiers, and later folks like John Wayne and so on. So again, I was early on very suspicious about the centrality of theology. Now, that does not mean that theology does not matter. It just doesn't matter in the way that many evangelicals claim it does. That the interaction between cultural values, cultural commitments, and yes, political commitments, and theology is very much a two-way street. Whereas evangelicals will say, I believe, and therefore I do this, or I have this theological view, or I mean, political view, right? The theology always precedes social and cultural and political values. And that is just not historically supportable. And so you see much more of a two-way street there. And the example of SBC and inerrancy is an example of that, where certain theological commitments become the be all end all, and then others are cast aside. And so for me, it became really interesting to see which Bible verses were really upheld as, gospel truth and the guide to living a Christian life, and especially which ones were not. So, turn the other cheek. Nope, we're going to dispense with that. Like, they will literally say, no, we're not doing that. Doesn't apply to us. Love your neighbor as yourself, love your enemies, these sorts of things explained away. Welcome the stranger, right? All of these things. Nope. I mean, the fruits of the Spirit, essentially the fruit of the Spirit for the male sex, nope, doesn't apply. So we just need to be much more curious about this relationship between theology and cultural and political values, and not take evangelicals at their word. And as soon as you kind of present these case studies, I think it becomes really clear. And evangelicals themselves, in fact, who have read this book, often come away convinced that you're right. The stories we've been telling ourselves do not hold up under scrutiny.
Oh my gosh. I mean, that chapter was, I think, probably the one that hurt personally a little bit for me in a really healthy way, right? Because for the most part, I mean, even though I grew up evangelical, I always thought James Dobson was kind of out there. And I mean, all the characters in your book, and by characters, I don't mean fake people. I mean real, hugely followed evangelical leaders. But I read Wild at Heart when I was in college, and that like sang to my cute little manly heart. It made me feel like such a man. And when you talked about William Wallace and how basically,
yeah, that one hurt me too.
I'm so sorry.
I think I grew into college and into my young adulthood thinking that Jesus is like William Wallace. Yeah. And I think probably there's a lot of listeners who are like, duh, Jesus is like William Wallace. He's a freedom fighter, like
Yeah.
the book of Revelation. And that one I had to unpack a little bit about how much of my theology in my young adulthood, which is very formative, by the way,
Yes.
was formed by Braveheart, William Wallace,
Mhm.
Wild at Heart, that whole deal. Whoa, that's intense.
You
Yeah.
are not alone in that. I mean, right. I've heard from so many men. I mean, I've literally received hundreds of messages from evangelicals, especially evangelical men, since this book has come out. And,
Mhm.
some version of that, of just realizing how much this has shaped their faith. And yeah, the William Wallace thing, if I had been able to come up with a great title that could have had, William Wallace in it, I probably would have gone with that. But I really needed Mel Gibson's William Wallace from the movie Braveheart, and
Yeah.
that just it wasn't really workable. So John Wayne, really John Wayne and William Wallace were the two,
Yeah.
but William Wallace certainly, but he only comes in the 2000s, really, with
Mhm.
well, I mean, in the late 90s. I think the movie Braveheart was 96, and that's really when you very
Yeah.
soon after start to see this kind of backlash against the soft patriarchy of the Promise
So that was,
Keepers. And then by 2001, that's when Eldridge's book comes
yeah,
out, just
my
months before
God.
9/11, and kind of we know the rest of the story.
I'm feeling like I'm sitting under analysis at the moment as I'm remembering all this stuff. Like, I would have been 10 years old when Braveheart came out, which just strikes me. Like, I've been a pacifist and a feminist for years, and I still cannot watch that movie without bawling like a child. And a lot of it, I'm realizing, it's like subcognitive, right?
Yeah.
A lot of race philosophers of race, for example, have talked about how racism is embodied. It's not changing your mind about it, doesn't seem to actually change your interactions with people of color. And I'm thinking, shit, the same thing's happening here when I watch Braveheart, right? I don't believe that stuff anymore, but man, I feel it.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I just rewatched it this summer just for fun, and I had my kids watch it with me. They'd never seen it before. And yeah, it is a powerful, powerful movie,
And
and
you picked on
all the
Patriot
themes.
too,
Yes.
the other Mel Gibson
Oh my
movie that
gosh.
formed my childhood.
This
How
has to
dare
be one
you?
of the worst movies ever, but
That's incredible. Oh man, Kristen, we are going to have like a mini series with you about contemporary Christian music from the 80s and 90s, talking about movies. I mean, like we're striking something here, I feel like. Um, Part of, I think, what I've observed in your book as well, that possibly maybe even the main reason why evangelicalism is what it is today, is this constant obsession with power, this constant obsession with having a relevant and meaningful voice in the culture, in the world around us, having political influence, having, and if the scientists don't agree with us, we're going to have our own scientists. And this lust for power is this real, if you start pulling that thread, almost all of evangelicalism seems like it just totally unravels. Would you agree with that it goes back to the very beginning?
yeah, I mean, that is the thread of the book. That when I have to really simplify, this is a book about power. It's a book about the grasping for power, and so to get back to that kind of juxtaposition of the, Jesus will save your soul, John Wayne will save your ass. Ultimately, the needing a John Wayne to save your ass, or a Donald Trump to, bust up all your enemies, that is at its heart a theological
Mhm.
claim, right? So there is a theology there, and that really is what I'm getting at in the subtitle, the corrupted of faith part. The fact that, the Jesus of the Gospels does get transformed into this ruthless warrior Christ,
Mhm.
who's going to slay his enemies. And let me just note too that that's not a historical claim. The corrupted of faith part. That's my part as, okay, I'm going to speak right now to evangelicals themselves, because this book is largely a history,
Mhm.
but it is framed with this kind of critical framing, right? And a religious critique. As a person of faith myself, I'm bringing that in, and I just wanted to speak to evangelicals very clearly. Again, you self-identify as this. This is what you claim to hold as truth. Here's what we see in front of us. And so the corrupted of faith part is exactly that. I think fundamentally, as I understand the story of the Gospels, and really the story of Christianity, and who Christ is, it is this countercultural narrative of, Christ divesting himself of power and offering himself for the redemption of the world. And so to then transform that faith into one that is ever grasping for power and maintaining that power and then using that power coercively, to me, that is ultimately the corruption of the faith, that as I understand it. So yeah, there's a theological claim there.
That's good. I'm really glad you put that in the title. Like, well done.
Mm-hmm.
Kyle, do we want to, we got quite a few questions left. Is there any that you're willing to drop off, or where do you want to go
Well,
from here?
how are you feeling, Kristin?
I'm good. My kids are all in bed, so we're good.
Okay. I actually think the pace is really good. I'm surprised at how many we've gotten through already so far. I didn't think we'd be this far along. Let me just ask a couple more, and then we'll check in again if that's okay. So on this connection, and let me preface this by saying that I have no actual critiques of the book. I loved every part of it except for the parts that made me hate my childhood. So this is not a critique whatsoever. It's an honest question. This connection between people like John Wayne or Oliver North or the other heroes of militant masculinity, Teddy Roosevelt, whatever, those guys on one hand and Donald Trump on the other. Okay. So a large part of the end of the book is making that connection between how we can understand the almost wholesale embrace of Donald Trump by white evangelicals because of this militant masculinity thing that they had long since imbibed. For my part, it doesn't make sense to me, because when I look at Donald, like the argument makes sense, and I totally grant all of the historical details that you provide. But when I look at Donald Trump, I do not see masculinity. I do not see John Wayne. I do not see Oliver North. I mean, the guy wouldn't know a bench press from a French press. You know what I mean? Like he's literally an overweight, draft dodging, wishy-washy, believes the last thing that was told to him, amoral inheritance billionaire.
Yes.
He's not Teddy Roosevelt. So I guess my question then is, do you think white evangelicals who have embraced him really believe their own propaganda about his masculinity?
So, I mean, there's not just one masculinity, right? There's not masculinity and like real masculinity and things that fall short. Masculinity is constantly in flux, right? It's very, there's always multiple masculinities. And these are things that, this is a trade book. So I had to be very careful about getting into, kind of specialized vocabulary that some, more gender studies lingo would have been helpful to parse this out a little bit more. But we were very disciplined in that respect. And where I wasn't, my editor made me change the wording. So I want to clarify that there are always multiple masculinities. And I think that what's key to is a lot of people say, like, Donald Trump isn't masculine, but he is performing masculinity in a certain type of masculinity. And he's performing masculinity in a throwback way, a very retrograde way, throwing back to the 1950s masculinity. And that comes through clearly at the end of the book too, towards the end of the book, that, people campaigning keep saying, this is John Wayne America. He's a symbol of John Wayne America. He's a symbol of he's a 1950s man. He's, it's very clear what they're doing. John Wayne was a symbol of throwback masculinity, right? To the cowboy, and the cowboys themselves were always kind of nostalgic for a time when, white men wielded power. And so really what the thread is, I think, that I would pull through there is the masculine right and duty to wield power. This is a very racialized conception of masculinity. So it's the white man's obligation to use violence to bring order. And that's where you see the cowboys of the Wild West, John Wayne in all of his movies. And in all of his movies, a distinctively white man using violence to subdue, in most cases, non-white populations, right? Sands of Iwo Jima, Green Berets, the Alamo. This is just kind of this cultural ideal of American masculinity. That's what we're talking about. So Donald Trump, that's kind of the strand that he is going to pull through, and it becomes in some cases more extreme because of this culture wars context, because of this kind of battle against feminism, against liberalism, against political correctness. And that's important to understand. Like by the 2000s, political correctness becomes, this great threat. And what is it? What does it actually threaten? You know, you shouldn't be rude anymore. You shouldn't be racist. You shouldn't, what is it really threatening? It's threatening this ability to, particularly for men, for white men, to say what needs to be said, to do what needs to be done, to wield their power that they, perceive themselves to have a right to wield. And that's the masculinity that Trump is so just unapologetically embodying in a way that is astounding. Right? It is still astounding to all of us on a daily basis. What even is this? Every tweet, I mean, every statement he makes, practically, it's completely like we are in a new era. And so he has really taken that, thumbing his nose at political correctness, at civility, at, following any rules at all. And so he's just like on steroids, taking that fearlessness, that ruthlessness, do what needs to be done for the sake of righteousness. Now, who's going to define the righteousness? And that's where we see the symbiotic relationship between Trump and his evangelical supporters. And they have embraced him. He has embraced them, and he is on their side. And then if he is on their side, he is on God's side. So that is really the strand that I would pull through. He's certainly not my ideal of masculinity, but the power that he wields, the way that he wields that power is playing on a long history of white masculine power.
And I mean, you spoke to that in the introduction, which was fantastic. But basically saying, I'm going to be making the case in this book that this reality that we hear about, that 81% of evangelicals voted for Donald Trump, but they did it while holding their nose and really were kind of ashamed of it. You said that's really not the case. And I'm going to make the case. And sure enough, you made the case. I mean, it didn't take very far in the book for me to be like, yeah, I mean, this whole thing's been built on like having a guy like Donald Trump be the end all be all. And that's where I would say I fully agree with you that Donald Trump's version of masculinity is a version of masculinity that we find in many, many fundamentalist and evangelical white churches, and in many, many it's our idea of masculinity, this broken masculinity where strength looks like bullying, and it looks like me getting the upper hand in every conversation. I mean, you just look at the first debate this last election season, and that's what masculinity looks like to many, many white evangelicals, and especially males. And that's where I think that's the perfect picture of why he resonated so deeply with so many evangelicals, even though they try. I'm getting a little bit us versus them here, a little bit. That's where I think he's the perfect representation in many ways of that movement, unfortunately.
Yeah. And then you can see, when you look back to somebody like Ronald Reagan, but particularly Oliver North, right? I got a little obsessed with Oliver North. I kept waiting for my editor to say enough is enough. Some of this has to go, and he didn't. And so I thought, okay, we're good then. But I mean, when you look at somebody like Oliver North, like how and why did he become this hero of the religious right? And I remember being really confused when I must have been in high school at the time, or maybe younger. I don't know. No, I would have been younger. I remember being really confused about this guy, Oliver North. Yeah, I was much younger, grade school. Because on the one hand, I would kind of watch the news, read Time or Newsweek, and it looked like he was kind of a traitor and he was on trial. And then the vibes I was picking up in religious circles was, this guy is amazing. I remember just never being able to reconcile that. And then it was only through my research that I realized, wait, I mean, not only did Falwell support him and Phyllis Schlafly, and he was like this huge hero, but then he was invited to go speak at the SPC's annual convention the first year that the conservatives had consolidated, fully consolidated their powers. Like, you've got to be kidding me, right? It is so intertwined. And there too, you don't have to follow the rules. There's a greater truth. You have access to it, and you need to follow God's commands, not even your commanders, or even potentially your commander in chief.
Yep. So I have one more question I just have to ask, and then I'll let Randy finish it up however he wants. So my wife and I are huge fans of Fred Rogers, and we just recently read his biography. It's called The Good Neighbor by Maxwell King. And I learned some fascinating stuff about him. And one of the things I didn't quite realize was just how involved in what was at the time cutting edge child psychology happening at the University of Pittsburgh, where he was from. So he studied his whole life under Margaret McFarlane. He was heavily influenced by Benjamin. And he was learning how to teach and speak to children from these people, and then directly applying it on a show. He would literally run his scripts over to Margaret McFarlane if he had an issue, get her critique, and then come back and restart filming. It actually really annoyed his production staff because he would just shut down production to go check on stuff. And so I'm probably the most grateful that, like, one of the things, and I don't think this is an exaggeration, one of the things that saved me, I think, from this militant masculinity of evangelicalism was that I had his influence, which was kind of historically accidental. He just happened to be on television when I was a kid. And so now looking back at that and learning more about him, I'm seeing, wow, I didn't realize there were these two competing conceptions of masculinity at war socially and even within my own head. And I'm really grateful that there were. So in some ways, it seems to me like many of the major political disagreements we're dealing with right now, almost, this is reductionist to say, but it almost boils down to those who followed Spock and Rogers and those who followed Dobson and John Wayne, you know? And recently at Biden's town hall, one of Trump's political advisors tweeted, "It's like watching Mr. Rogers."
Yes.
He thought it was an insult.
Exactly. You can see the divide on Twitter, right? Like, yeah, that's awesome, right? And exactly. Right? Yeah. Fred Rogers was interesting. I mean, but first of all, Spock, yes, the Spock connection. So Dobson, so anti-Spock, and he's trying to redeem American children from the damage that Spock had done. And of course, Spock, after he retired, ended up becoming an anti-war activist. So, that was just against all of these deeply held values, including militarism. We haven't talked much about militarism, but militarism being, a kind of fundamental value of conservative evangelicalism, really. I mean, you could go to the 1940s, but certainly by the 1960s as a distinctive value that set them apart from many other Americans who were becoming a lot more ambivalent towards the war and war in general. So Spock was seen as very dangerous. And what was fascinating to me in this research was to see just how often family values, like really raising your kids, husband, wife, having sex, these kinds of very intimate relationships were always connected to bigger issues. They were always connected to foreign policy. They were always connected to the youth rebellion, to authority and hierarchy in society at large. And so family values were inherently political, not just in the sense that we understand them, but in this very broad sense. And so Dobson was really against Spock and all that he stood for. And then, even John Wayne is coming out against Benjamin Spock, right? And blaming Benjamin Spock for the hippies and the throwing off of the authority of their parents, by which they meant patriarchal authority, right? Because which of the parents really has the authority there? And then, yes, Fred Rogers, conservative evangelicals, not a fan. And all this literature on militant masculinity, I mean, they're making that very clear. Like, Jesus was much more like William Wallace than like, Mr. Rogers or Mother Teresa. And so they're very clear. And yes, he is an emasculated man. He is exactly what is wrong with America. And if America raises their children, especially their boys, according to the values of Fred Rogers, right, the end is near, because we will not be able to defend ourselves against the very real enemies that await.
So toxic, man. Kyle, I want you to ask the 2020 question because
okay, sure, that'll be a good closer.
Well, I got another one after that.
Oh, okay, maybe it'll be a good penultimate question. A really simple one. I'm guessing since it was published this year, you probably finished it last year or thereabouts. Would it be any different if it had been published now? Is there anything that happened in 2020, the 10 years of 2020, that would have made it into the book?
When I finished this book, I mean, it's been described by reviewers as urgent and sharp-elbowed. And I really like that description. Had I absorbed 2020, I think the elbows would have been even sharper, right? I think a constant struggle as I wrote this book, just kind of internal as a writer, was, what is mainstream, what is fringe, how does this all fit together? How bad is this? And what I was looking at, I thought, this is really bad. I'd been living with this for years. And then those last 3 years really was deeply researching and writing the book, right? From 2016 on, I just thought, this is really bad. This is looking really bad. So much so when I got to the end of the manuscript and my editor read it the first time through, at the end, he just said, could you give us a little hope in the conclusion? And I wrote back to him saying, I thought about it. I was like, what can I do with this? And I was like, I don't think I can. I'm feeling as heavy as you are right now. This is the history I uncovered. I've got nothing else. And then he's like, okay, I respect that. And then a couple days later, I get another email. Could you just give us something, Kristin? Like, we need something. Like, we can't end with this. And that's when I gave him the last sentence of the book. And what was once done can also be undone. And honestly, at the time, it felt so flaky. It felt like, this is all I've got. He's like, fine, we'll take it. But I do really believe that, like, there is, knowing history, knowing how we got to this point can give us a chance to undo it. That said, it is what we are seeing now is so deeply embedded that it's hard not to be pessimistic once you know this history, right? Just how deep this is. This is not a little misunderstanding. This is not a let's open our Bibles together kind of thing and we'll clear this up, right? That's not going to work here. And so, no, 2020 has not changed the book or the conclusions at all. If anything, it has hardened those conclusions. I think we saw with the response to the coronavirus, saw the extent of this ideology taken to extremes that even I could not have anticipated, when people's own lives and the lives of their loved ones are very clearly at stake. I mean, they've been talking for decades about, threats to the family, threats to America, communism, radical Islam, secular humanism. Now we really have something that is literally killing hundreds of thousands of us. And it just, it didn't really touch this because the ideology was such that the enemy was not the virus. The enemy was, masks or mask mandates or liberals or China, or, it was defined otherwise. Survey data just continues to demonstrate this kind of loyalty to the ideology and to the Trump administration among white evangelicals. The Black Lives Matter movement revealed once again the extent of white evangelical racism and resistance to anti-racist efforts. And so, and again, the loyalty of white evangelical leaders to the Trump administration. So no, more of the same. 2020 is absolutely more of the same, and more profoundly so. So my guess is the book would have been even harsher, perhaps. And I did actually just, the paperback edition will be out in June. And so I just wrote a preface to the paperback edition. So a new preface that brings us up to the week after the election of 2020. And so I get to cover all of this in, 6 pages, 7 pages, but essentially giving this version of, yes, all of this holds, unfortunately, very well through 2020. The question is, what happens next, right? What happens post-inauguration? What happens to this movement? Historically, we've seen that it's usually when conservative evangelicals are out of power that they become most powerful, that they really, become more radicalized, and they give a lot more money to their organizations. They become they really renew their power. Under the presidency of Donald Trump was the first time that they kind of had one of their own in the White House, where their power was not diminished. They didn't kind of fall apart as they did during the end of the Reagan years or the Bush years, and kind of need to regroup. And then Barack Obama was this godsend because he was this enemy, and so they could coalesce again. Donald Trump had this uncanny ability to both give them access and privilege and power and continue to daily, hourly kind of incite resentment and fear and continue to stoke that. So what happens once he leaves office is a huge question to me. What are the dynamics going to look like? Are we going to see a further radicalization, or without him kind of tweeting from the Oval Office every day and when he looks like a loser, is his power going to actually be diminished? I have no idea.
Yeah, and I would completely agree with your take on current white evangelicalism and the future of it. I mean, it's why the church that I pastor, we decided to drop the evangelical label, because we for years have been like, we can do this, we can change evangelicalism, we can be the ones, and no, we can't. I mean, it's it's left the building, and we actually said we dropped the label evangelical for the sake of the gospel.
Yeah.
The gospel is too valuable. It's been diminished by this movement. So you said it's been described, your book, as having sharp elbows, and I will affirm and confirm that. But the beautiful part about it, Kristin, is you really didn't slam there was no opinion in here. It's just a history book. You're just quoting people. You're just literally going through the history and saying, this is what it is. This is what it is, just so you know, and letting everybody draw their own conclusion. It's the best way to have sharp elbows, is just data and statistics, right?
Yeah.
However, doing something that is very challenging to a huge movement that's seen as very much at the center of the gospel, or at the center of Jesus, that comes at a cost. Like I know from being a church leader, that saying things that might be true and real that might hurt comes at a cost. I'm sure I have no idea how much hate mail or hate tweets you've gotten as a result of this. But I want to know, what has writing this book done to your soul, Kristin? I mean, maybe both in good and bad ways. Like, is your family okay with everything? Have your relationships been affected by it? Like, what has it done to not Dr. Kristin Kobes Du Mez, but Kristin?
Oh, this is getting personal. Let's see. First, I will say that I anticipated that this would come with a cost, publishing this book. The cost has been much less than I feared. I have gotten almost no hate mail. I know it's shocking. My publisher's lawyer had warned me to prepare myself for vicious trolling, and kind of I locked things down a bit as the book came out. I've had just a little bit of that, not much at all thus far. And I've received fewer than a handful of negative letters of any sort, like not even mean spirited. I think there's maybe one that got kind of unpleasant, and I cut off that communication. That's it.
Oh.
I've again received hundreds of amazing letters from readers who've just said thank you, and some coming from surprising places, still deep inside evangelical organizations and institutions and positions of power. So that has been really encouraging and a source of hope. I will also say that I have the privilege of not being a pastor, and I've watched very closely dynamics around leadership, pastoral leadership, and the limits of pastoral leadership. And I think that pastors have an incredibly difficult job right now, because they are not the leaders that they might think they are, or we might think they ought to be. This is a populist movement, and the sources that form people's spiritual, religious, political, cultural values are largely not coming directly from the pulpit, right? There are so many other sources of Christian media, these networks, again, this consumer culture that you're, in some cases, the Sunday morning sermon is just a drop in the bucket. And so the power dynamics are often kind of reversed. And that's something I write about just a little bit in the book. And I've written about elsewhere as well, just watching, especially becoming evident during the Trump years.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Pastor.
What was that?
So that was depressing as a pastor to read.
Yeah.
Very, Very true. People don't get their theology and their discipleship from Sunday morning sermons. They get it from the talking heads. Man, that's depressing.
It is. It is. So, I mean, it's helpful to know what you're up against, because I think a lot of pastors have been really shocked at their lack of influence over people in the pews, with respect to, how you vote, how you engage in politics, but much more recently with respect to even, will you wear a mask when you come into, or will we go remote, or what must we meet in person? These sorts of things. Again, the limits of pastoral leadership are very evident right now. So I'm in the privileged position of not being a pastor. I'm a professor. And so I have academic freedom, and I'm using that academic freedom. And so the risks are there, but I'm protected to a certain extent. And so the risks are not the same as if I were a pastor, saying some of these things. So I felt a responsibility to use that freedom well. And I'm a professor, so I profess. But then there's still the personal, right? There's the fact that I personally am deeply embedded in these communities, and my own relationships often cross over this political chasm. And that has been really hard. That was hard before I started writing this book. It became harder as I was writing this book. And there have been some really hard moments. And at a certain point, I mean, if you read my acknowledgments at the end, I'm addressing that rather evasively, but it's there. I really think that in this historical moment, I think we're all called to be faithful, as faithful as we can be, and we're called, and that will require courage. And that there are so many forces within evangelicalism, I think, that that work against that. Be nice. Don't disrupt. Don't disrupt your church. Don't disrupt relationships. Don't rock the boat. Don't tarnish the church's witness. Don't, even that original impulse of mine that sounded kind of noble, and it felt noble at the time. Do I really want to shine this bright light on the dark underside of American evangelicalism? Right? Was that a good impulse, or was that just brand protection? And is that exactly what has gotten us where we are now? I wasn't going to follow the truth that I saw in front of me. And so I set it aside. And so I think this is a moment that each of us has to ask, what is required of us? How are we positioned? And there are going to be costs. Sometimes those costs aren't going to be as dire as we fear. Sometimes they will be. I know many people who have lost their jobs over speaking out, speaking into this moment. I know many families that have been deeply divided. And I know lots of churches that have really struggled, and relationships that have been broken. And so I think that there's a cost for all of us. I will also say that when you make that choice, and if you can do so with as much grace and truth as you can muster, you will also find others who are doing that. And the support that I've received has been just phenomenal. I just, the relationships that I have made because of the work that I'm doing, and the connections that I've found to other people who are doing this, has been incredibly life-giving. And so it comes with cost, but also, to use a very evangelical word, with great blessing too.
Mhm. Well, I mean, Kristin, thank you for having the bravery to write this book. I think for having the bravery, and can I just say, in honor of your chapter heading, thanks for having the balls to write this book.
Absolutely.
I really do
There's
think
an ironic ending to this episode.
but I really do think that this could be the book that 10 years from now we look back on and say, this was the book that gave a bunch of people permission to say, that's not me anymore. I can't do it anymore. I side with Jesus more than I side with the evangelical movement, with white evangelical movement. I side with the gospel more than I identify as an evangelical, and I can't do it anymore. And so it's just a very, very important book. Last question. You have another book coming out called Live, Laugh, Love, I believe, right? I saw it
Yes.
on Twitter. Can you tell us a little bit about it? Because it sounds incredible.
Oh, I just can't wait. Yeah, I'm ready to leave this testosterone fueled masculinity behind. But you never really can. I've learned. But yes, my next book is kind of the flip side. It is a cultural history of white Christian womanhood. It's been on my radar for so long. And even as I was writing Jesus and John Wayne, and I was writing about Phyllis Schlafly and Maribel Morgan, Elizabeth Elliot, I knew that there was the rest of that story that I didn't have time to get into because Elizabeth Elliot is still influential, but right now we've moved on. We have Janet Oak and we have Beverly Lewis and we have mommy bloggers and we have a multi-level marketing and Hallmark movies and HGTV, and that's really this purveyor of white Christian womanhood as a cultural ideal. And so I really want to investigate that. And what does that do if culture really does shape theology? And this is the culture of white Christian womanhood that really is pervasive in many evangelical circles and now far beyond evangelical circles. What does that do? What does that do to Christianity? What does that do to theology? What does that do to politics? And so it's a super fun project. I'm now watching Hallmark movies in my spare time, reading a lot of really bad novels and inspirational fiction, and it is absolutely a blast. So yes, Live, Laugh, Love will be out in I think 2023.
2023. Reading inspirational fiction as fun. Whoa.
It's got to
I
be
guess,
better than listening to Mark Driscoll sermons on repeat.
right. I did have to, as I started into this project, I was like, okay, next project, I've got to do something like Dostoevsky or something. Like I'm going to need a different kind of literature to engage with after this round. But no, this is super fun. And yeah, I just announced that book this week on Twitter and social media, and already I have just been swamped. I haven't even had a chance to respond to most of them with letters from women who are like, I am here for this. Oh, and here's my stories. So I think it's going to be a lot like Jesus and John Wayne in that respect, that when particularly Christian women read this, or just women, white women in particular, I think a lot of them are going to say, oh my gosh, this is the story of my life in the same kind of way. And then I hopefully have the tools to start to understand and what has that done for you? Ideals of beauty, ideals of femininity, of domesticity. What has that done for you? What do you want to, hold on to, and what do you really need to set aside?
Wow. Can't wait. Super fun. The book is Jesus and John Wayne. Again, just get it and read it. And then we can have a group session afterwards and process all of the feeling. But Dr. Kristin Kobes Du Mez, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for the time.
Oh, thank you. This was absolutely great.